mansions, you're able to gain more insight about the mansion, its history, and the people who were tenants at this house that is full of rich history. And feel free, as I'm talking, to check the chat. Megan, we're checking the chat. Megan as well. We have two Megans and myself. And what I'm hoping that we do is really build a conversation. So throughout, and we'll leave time to also hear your voices towards the end of the presentation. And again, my name is Angela Garcia, and I'm an educator not only at the mansion, but many other museums here in New York. And I'm an art historian. So when looking at proposing a program for you today, it made sense for me to really think about Morris-Jumel Mansion's history through its portraits. So just curious, when I say that in terms of portraits or portraiture, right? And we're gonna be we're taking a closer look at portraiture at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. What comes to mind? And feel free to start typing in the chat, especially when we think of a historic house, right? Where we think about, we're gonna learn about history and maybe don't immediately think art. What comes to mind about portraiture, or how would you define portraiture today? Before we begin, and I'm curious, and just let us know as we begin. So as I begin, I want to give you a brief introduction, and maybe some of you have visited the mansion many times, or their staff members on the call. So we're going to have a rich conversation today, I think. And by all means, if you've never visited, this is still a perfect opportunity for us to engage in a conversation. But the mansion, as we know today, Morris-Jumel Mansion, really was built as a home, a summer home for the Colonel Roger Morris and Mary, and his wife Mary, right? And the Morris built this home in 1765 as a summer home, a retreat. And it's located in what today we know as Washington Heights, right? And I see you all are thinking about painted portraits of family members and notable people. So today I'll be featuring some of these notable figures that are closely connected to the history of the mansion. On the left, you have Roger Morris, who had this home built. It was said it was a wedding gift to his wife, Mary, who you have on the right. And both are copies or images of miniatures that really represent their image. And I see a lot of you say a representation of a person, of status. And I want us to do that today together, really take a closer look and see what these portraits and tell us about the history and about these important figures, right? And how they display wealth, for example. And so you're looking at a print of the Roger Morris house as it's had in the plot of land and how it would have looked from it was built in 1765, but this print is from 1854, just to give you a sense. And another important figure that many people will come to and visit us to learn more about and his time at the mansion was George Washington, right? And you have a portrait of Washington that inspired many artists, and some artists, and an artist, in fact, who I'll show you today, who's in our collection. And in terms of how to represent a portrait of a notable figure. But Washington had a 5-week stay at Morris-Jumel Mansion in the outbreak of the American Revolution. And he spent about those 5 weeks, won an important battle, the Battle of Harlem Heights there. And he then retreated further north, as well as the British really approached. And so we are known for this moment as well, but he had a second important visit at the mansion. Now he was president, and he visits and hosts a cabinet dinner, right? With the important figures of the likes of Thomas Jefferson, Adams, figures who will also become presidents, Alexander Hamilton, John Quincy and Henry Knox, right? And this would have taken place on the grounds of the mansion. And you see a view of the home. Then the home, after Washington leaves and retreats further north, goes through a period of being abandoned. The Morrises were loyalists, and they were loyal to the British crown. So they're going to also leave and be forced to leave, and they decide to return back to England. And the house is left abandoned. At some point, it becomes a tavern or an inn. It functions as that. But it's not till 1810 that the Jumels enter. And on the right, you have Eliza Jumel, who become a very important figure who we'll see several moments today, and Stephen Jumel. Stephen Jumel was a French merchant, became very wealthy. He was born in France, but also lived for many years in Saint-Domingue, which today, part of the island of Hispaniola at the time when it was colonized, and today known as Haiti, the part of the island was known as Haiti. He's going to, along with his wife, Eliza Jumel, purchase the former Roger Morris residence in 1810. And you're going to notice something on the left, right? I did not make a mistake, right? It's not that I forgot to put in a portrait or an image of Stephen Jumel. It is that to date, we have not identified any portrait of Stephen Jumel, although his image has been described as this extremely very handsome man who was really tall in stature. We don't know if that was he was described that way because he was extremely wealthy and it was exaggerated, but we'll continue to do that research and really try to locate. So something you can do today, maybe you will be sparked and you can join us in this journey, because what's great about the mansion is that although it's history in the past, it's something that we keep alive and continue to fill in the gaps, what's missing. And that's what brings me to portraiture, because for me, portraits are visual sort of documents that really help tell the story of the mansion. And you guys are saying such wonderful things.
Yes.
And we're going to come back to In Touch to really include you in this conversation, right? And Roger Morris was an officer, a former officer in the British Army that was shared, and as a loyalist he did, right, that I mentioned. And if you would kindly for a moment just make sure you're on mute, and then we'll definitely have some chatter later. Make sure to include time. So I want to take you virtually to the mansion, right? Imagine yourself and sort of right in front. And this is usually where we meet groups. Anyway, I often work with school groups, we work with adults and family programs. But when we greet students, we usually tend to greet them right by those steps. So imagine yourself there, looking at the facade of this mansion. And I could talk for another sort of 30 minutes or an hour of just the architecture on the exterior alone.
That can be your next lunch break lecture.
maybe. And you see it's a two-story home, right? Look at the beautiful colonnades, the portico, and imagine yourself entering that sort of entrance, this Palladian style architecture of the period, and just another side view so you can really feel like you're there. And then you enter this great hall, and you already immediately you're greeted by portraiture, right? And this portrait greets you to the right after you make the entrance. And this sofa that I think goes so well, right? So feel free, as I begin to show you and we begin to get a closer look at some of the portraits that hang in the mansion, for you to comment what you're seeing, what you're noticing. I'm going to invite you to join me into this close look. And this is something we do as well at the mansion, right? Really bring you in and we discover the history together through these visual or documents or objects. And you see, if you see my cursor, right? This beautiful sofa that dates to the 1820s style, and it complements and draws us into this portrait. And we're gonna draw close in. And what do you notice? What do you begin to see in this portrait? And please share in the comments. And I'll then tell you, a
Okay.
lot of tassels,
A lot of
right?
tassels.
And metals, tents in the background, vibrant colors you share with me. And what, as you're putting this together, you're noticing metals, tents in the background. Who do you think this portrait is representing, or what story might it be telling you? And Lauren shares military heritage, perhaps, or Barbara. Hi, Barbara. Barbara's a colleague. Is it in a landscape, right? And we see in the background maybe a landscape, a battlefield of some sort. And it takes us to this idea, Linda, to this idea of war. Is it someone who may have come back from the war? And
we have some nationalities that people are suggesting as well.
And that's interesting. What nationalities do you sort of identify just by the colors of the uniform?
Susan thinks he appears to be French, while Alexis thinks he may be a member of the British military.
And interesting, right? And or landowner, or Vicky shares, and are there First Nation people behind them? And what very interesting perspectives that you're sharing with us, right? And we see someone, yes, connected to the military. And it's interesting you say begin to identify nationalities, because one of the first things people ask of this portrait, and I think you can ask many questions of a portrait and engage in a conversation with it, is that, especially when we have school groups, they come in and they point out and they're like, is that George Washington? Or even families come in and they're coming in thinking about the time that George Washington spent here. But I use that as an opportunity to really draw our groups in, and we look closely. And this is in fact a Hessian soldier, right? And it really tells something I hadn't shared with you yet. It's the story of the occupation of British and Hessian soldiers at the mansion at Morris-Jumel. After George Washington retreats north, the British and Hessian soldiers occupy the mansion for a period of time. And Hessian soldiers, I don't know if many of you are familiar, were hired mercenaries, essentially hired soldiers who were veterans, highly experienced in battles. And this portrait really brings and ties in that story together. This is a portrait, and you could see the colorful uniforms you all pointed out and the details. And they wore varied uniforms, right? And often people discuss while we're on site, it was blue coats and the red coats, right? To represent Continental Army, represent the British, but the uniforms were very varied, and there were times where there wasn't money to embellish, so sometimes they wouldn't swamp. But they definitely described Hessian soldiers as having these bright, colorful uniforms, and they could decide and on the details, right? So this is a portrait of Vilem von Hess, and he was not at the mansion, but he was nearby on the grounds, who was the commanding officer at the mansion, was another Hessian general. And we're going to share with you all this details and information, titles of portraits, and resources at the end. So feel free to just stay on and look closely, because we'll definitely, if you're interested in saying more. And so Vicky shares with the Hessian soldiers buried at some historic sites in New York, indeed. And we're going to find, and I think you're going to, there are many connections that connects us also to other locations throughout the city. So we can all, if we could, take a virtual journey throughout the entire city, just with the history that's sparking off from the mansion. Right? And I appreciate all your engagement in the chat, and continue to do so. And I recall that again, that we're going to get a little more into portraits, the portraits that hang on the mansion, the portrait of Eliza Jumel that I kind of teased at the beginning, And as I mentioned, Stephen Jumel, we're currently still as part of our scholarship, continuously looking to identify that. And if anyone has more information, you could always contact the mansion as well. So a new part of the history of the story can be told by these two portraits that you have, right? On the right, I'd shown you before just a detail of that portrait. And on the left, we have another portrait that tends to accompany this. I have someone who wants to add a little color to, I think, our presentation. So what you're seeing is somebody's being an artist, I think, and annotating on the presentation, but by no means is it part of the actual representation. On the left and right, you have Eliza Jumel, and to the left, Eliza Jumel will remarry after Stephen Jumel passes away. And if we just recall that Stephen Jumel passed away actually in 1832. And the portrait on the right was painted just about a year after Eliza Jumel's husband is deceased, and right before she marries this figure on the left. And I'm curious if any of you identify who the figure is in this portrait.
We might be able to give you a hint if there are any fans of the Hamilton musical out there. Oh, I think we've got it. David and Marcella. Yep, everybody knows it's Aaron Burr.
All right, and what gave it away? Is it a very sort of an image you kind of immediately recognize, identify? The profile David shares, and it is a profile that became a standard representation of Burr, right? And I think we can really think about, and I asked you at the beginning, how do you define portrait, right? Today, think about the selfie, or how we have portraits made. We think about our image, right, a lot, and how what image we want to portray, how do we want to look. And although this is not a photograph, and photography was invented in the 1840s, the same ideas are still present, right? It's how do you want to appear to others? And Aaron Burr, who's vice president, when he married Eliza Jumel, in fact, at the mansion, and they married the parlor, you would enter the mansion, and right to the left, you would be standing right in the very room where Burr and Eliza Jumel married, and they were married out of convenience. In fact, I would share, Eliza Jumel was one of the wealthiest women in New York City, had become, and especially after she widowed and owned a lot of land, a lot of property. And Burr had, right, his political ties. He wanted to marry her for her wealth. She wanted the political and the status, right? Being Madame Vice President, essentially. And that image that you recognize, that profile, and you say it's, and I'm gonna address some details and some comments in the chat, is in fact inspired by a portrait that Burr collaborated with a notable portrait artist, Vanderlyn, by the name of Vanderlyn, and I'll share a little bit more information about that in a moment. And he was thinking about how he would be portrayed, right? And on the right, you begin to ask these questions, and I love it when you ask questions about the portraits, right? Is she still in mourning of her first husband? You ask, right, Lauren, by wearing black. So let's look a little closer at that detail, right? And I'm showing you that portrait of Eliza Jumel. She hadn't commissioned this portrait about a year after Stephen Jumel passed away. So this is from 1833. And she is wearing this black dress, and it is known as a widow's dress, right? A year in, she was still in mourning. What other details? Her lace is very simple, right? Very simplified Sherilyn Shehorn shares. And notice that lace detail of the bonnet. And we're looking at a widow, but also a woman who's about to marry a former vice president, Mary Burr. She is dressed very simple with lace blanc. Yes, I see that you are all very well informed that she named her daughter after herself, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And she looks very fashionable, and Barbara shares. And although she's in mourning, she's still very much dressed in the fashion of the times, right? This lace detail you see in the collar, right? Meant to create more of this kind of conservative sense on that kind of open collar that she's wearing, or on the bonnet was very much on trend. So she's in mourning, but she's very much aware of what the styles are. And this is something that was key and important to Eliza Jumel. Decorated the home to the nines in the French Empire style, and from her clothing to the furniture that she surrounded herself with, really were very much of the taste of the moment. Her hands are in the portrait. Vanessa shares, is it true those portraits were more expensive, right? And we can get a little bit more into like having your portrait painted. Still, yes, was expensive. And the cost of a portrait depended also on the scale, how much of the figure is represented. So we have sort of a 3/4, almost profile view of the sitter. And the more of your body that was shown, the more expensive it would be. And so the wealthy would have their portraits commissioned, right? Thinking about how their image could carry on, how could they represent themselves in society. And do you notice where she's seated? Could you recognize? And I'm just going to show you a little detail.
It might be a little difficult due to the glare.
Yes, and my apologies for that. On the screen, and I'll invite you as soon as we reopen for you to come in person to really be able to appreciate these details.
Susan thinks it looks like by the mansion. Barbara thinks maybe in a window.
Yes, and what makes you say that, Susan and Barbara, right? Why do you think the mansion, what detail is reminding you of the mansion in particular? And we'll look at where she's the front area of the mansion. There's a column there, perhaps. And you do have this Greco kind of Roman inspired column that's in that background to the left of this portrait that also appeared and was much of taste. And Eliza and her husband, Stephen Jumel, are responsible for incorporating some of those details on the facade of the mansion as well. When they became owners in 1810, they went on an extensive renovation of the mansion. And also, when you visit the mansion, you'll see there's some details in the back that for me, it reminds me as well. The interior. You were going to say something, Megan?
So it looks like Susan is calling attention to the bottom left part of the portrait.
Okay. So bottom left, and pardon the glare on your screen, right? I'm teasing you so you can come and meet me at the mansion and see this up close. What do you notice here, right? She's seated on what is almost like a cushion, right? Her arm is resting on a cushion. She's in the sofa. And we're going to go back to Alexis' point about the marriage in just a second, because I know there's some questions. But I'm going to show you where this portrait lives in the mansion so you can get a sense of this portrait. She commissioned the portrait, so she had this painted for it to hang in the space at the mansion. And here, this is the interior of the Octagon Room. So you would see Eliza, where my cursor is at, is hanging over this sofa, which is a Duncan Fife attributed sofa. And she had commissioned the sofa and a suite of 12 chairs that you see on the row there. And notice that it's covered in this red upholstery. So the furniture was recently restored and inspired by, in fact, by that very same sofa that appears in the portrait. And yes, Duncan Fife was a famous furniture maker, and we have that collection on site. So also you could, beyond the portraiture, you'll be able to also experience the furniture that she commissioned and collected as well.
Angela, in the essence of time, I was wondering if we might be able to spend some time with the larger portrait.
Yes, and quickly, that this portrait of Aaron Burr was inspired by John Vanderlyn's portrait. That's also part of the New York Historical Society's collection, so you could also visit, and we'll share some resources for you. And just as we begin to sort of close, I wanted to share with you this portrait, a portrait that for many visitors holds a very special place, and for the people that are in fact in this representation, right? And what you have here is a portrait that hangs right across from that portrait of the Hessian soldier. Really briefly, and I think here, as we begin to sort of look at the last work and share, if you either want to put in the chat or kind of unmute, show your hand and unmute yourself, you can feel free to share, and I'll share and answer whatever questions come up for you about this portrait. Right? Vicky says this portrait really evokes a mood, right? And Vicky, tell us, what mood do you think it evokes for you? And tell us a little bit more about that. But this is definitely a portrait that greets you in its grandeur. This is a slightly larger than life-size scaled portrait, a group portrait.
Charlene loves the lace in particular. Yes. She says it's fabulous.
It's really fabulous. I'm going to show you a detail of that lace in just a slide, or next slide in a moment, but I want to show you that scale of that portrait. This is the scale that we're looking at, and this is right in that great hall of the mansion. We have this group portrait. We have a sense of family, as Lauren adds. Eliza with her daughter and son as a question, yes. So we see her, and let's just point out, in this kind of lace shawl, and this is Eliza Jumel. Much later, 1854, she's about 80 years old, but she's still very much dressed in fashionable attire. That lace was very much on trend. You could decorate your lace shawl, also you have a lace bonnet, as we've seen, and decorated with flowers, right? And notice all the decorative details that are also part of our collection. So we have both the portrait and the actual shawl that appears in the portrait. And someone asked, does the size of the portrait change your view of it? Interesting to think about scale and how you are in comparison to that, and how that changes your perception of the portrait, right? And she's holding flowers, also another period of view. Listen to my colleague Daniela talk about our rose garden about a week ago, those details that appear in the portrait. She's holding a rose. In the chat, it's been brought up, grandchildren. And this is Eliza Jumel with her grandchildren. She, in fact, adopted her niece in her lifetime and raised her as her own daughter. And that niece, or her adopted daughter, had two children, also named Eliza on the right, who at the time in the portrait is 17 years old, and on the left, 13-year-old William Chase. And they had embarked on this great European tour where they visited many, many cities and went to Italy and had their portrait painted by Arcilde Ecole, in fact, and who was an Italian notable painter of the time, but he was really flourished at the time of this painted portrait. And just think about, we talked this conversation about wealth and how expensive it was to have a portrait made. Eliza Jumel goes on this grand tour to Europe, commissions a group portrait. This is the first time her grandson is able to accompany her on the trip. He's old enough. And imagine the size of that scale, and then having that made abroad and then shipping it back to New York at that time, right? And she had it shipped back to New York, and it's hung, and she lived along this portrait. And in fact, there were letters where she shared with young Eliza, who was available at the time. And what you see her holding is a dance card. And that's kind of a clue that tells you that they were presenting her as well as sort of this young, and that she was available to, old enough to marry, right? And sort of a presentation of Eliza. The hairstyle is of the time, coiled up into these buns on the side.
There are some questions too, or people are noticing that she's wearing a bracelet, that there are some flowers in the hair, and other perhaps status symbols with the necklace. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, and these are definitely symbols, right? And when we think about portraiture, you have to think as much as who is being represented as the artist that is doing the representation and what both parties want to express and have come across. For the sitter, right, this may be status of wealth. For the artist, it might be an opportunity to show skill, right, and technique as well. From the details, the fabric, the rich, expensive fabric, that tells us also about what they're able to afford and about trends of the time, but also in the skill in representing that sheen that fabric might be giving off, right? The light hitting every detail. And just look at that necklace. That's coral, a coral necklace. And coral was very popular at the time, from the 1830s all the way into the 1860s. Everything coral, from coral sets, a bracelet, a necklace. And the bracelet for me is one of the most fascinating details, because it's almost like a portrait in a portrait. And it makes me think of miniatures, which is also the time. We're looking at paintings, but at this time, people were getting miniatures commissioned. They were silhouettes was really much of the time and in the period. And so we have to look at different types of representation in portraiture. So excellent questions.
All right, yes. Other people are noticing details like he's wearing a ring.
Yeah. The ring always brings up lots of questions, right? Sorry, Megan, to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're fine.
But I think one of the things people actually ask about the ring is it an engagement ring or a wedding band? Mm-hmm. And we know that it's not. He wasn't engaged or married at the time. So the exact reason why he's wearing, there still could be questions about that, but it is not an engagement or a wedding band. He was about 13 years old at the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we leave enough time for some questions. If anyone has any additional thoughts or questions, please continue to put them in the chat.
Yes, please. And just finally, Silde Carlo Ercole, if you are interested in, there have been identified other portraits of his, but this was done on that trip to Italy. And as you begin to ask final questions, another thing to share is that for Eliza, when she marries her granddaughter, who remains and stays on this trip, and she's in Paris, is wedded in Paris, this portrait becomes the stand-in for that relationship, which was a very close relationship. And she describes in her letters that when they would gather as a family with the grandson and the son-in-law, Eliza Jumel's son-in-law, Nelson Chase, that they would sit in the drawing room at the mansion and look at the portrait. And then it felt like they were together. So it also has this kind of emotional attachment. And it's a sort of a portrait that means many things to many parties at the mansion. And in closing, and just to kind of tease this, like I mentioned the silhouette, right? And the silhouette also being and having its moment in this genre of portraiture at the time. And we have an exhibition in the works that I hope when things reopen and we kind of regain some sense of normalcy or a new normal, that you would visit us and visit this exhibition that was set to open if 2021, hopefully. And it touches on the silhouette, and Auguste Edouard, who was a great propeller of the silhouette and an important figure. And you see the representation of Madame Jumel. So I'll leave you that with that tease. And here you can think about your own, if you could commission a portrait, how would you want to be captured? And I will allow you for this last minute or two, if you're still on the call with me, to unmute yourself, or I'll take a look at the chat, and any final thoughts or questions that you cannot leave us without sharing, please feel free to do so.
So it seems that Jody was with us on Saturday for our lunch break lecture with Chris about the paranormal at the mansion.
Oh, yes.
Welcome back, Jody. And she wants to know if the soldier in the portrait might be the same soldier that is said to be seen in the mansion as a ghost.
That's a great question, Jody. The soldier in the portrait, Von Hess, was never actually at the mansion. He was stationed nearby the mansion, but the story that Jody is referring to, really connects to the story of a soldier who would have been there because they would have made it their headquarters at that time, and might have had a fall down the set of stairs that leads you to the second floor. That's the next question.
Depends on who you ask.
So it depends who you ask.
Yes,
exactly. And thank you. I want to be mindful of your time, so please allow me to thank you all for joining me, sharing, keeping the chat lively.
Absolutely. Yes, Mary, would you like to share something? Are you unmuted?
Yes, I'm right here.
Wonderful. Would you like to ask Angela a question?
Yes, please. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I would never be there in person since I'm all the way in Boston, but how long do you think it would have taken a painter to paint a portrait like the one we just saw of the two grandchildren and the lady?
Thank you for that question, Mary. That is an excellent question.
It is pardon, go ahead, Meg.
Oh no, go ahead. What do you think, Angela?
I think it would vary, right? Because at this time, there was a lot of competition, right? So the artists and portrait artists were looking at trying to complete portraits as quickly as possible so that they were able to get more commissions. And that's one of the things that they would advertise as well, and about the speed that they were able to work in. But it could take from several sittings. First of all, the process of having to have the person represented come and sit for that portrait. But I know that Eliza Jumel went and spent about a couple of months during this trip. So she might have sat before she returned to New York about a few times for him, and he had a period of a few weeks or months to complete it before it was sent out. Right, and so there's some liberties taken from that portrait.
Yes.
Well, so keep that in mind.
I'm curious to know if we could just go back to that portrait for a moment.
Yes.
How old everyone thinks that Eliza may be in this portrait.
And you could just say it out loud. Unmute yourself, everyone. Let's hear your voices.
70s, 80,
50,
80,
60s,
80. Huh.
maybe 50.
65.
We kind of have a range here,
50.
like the low 50.
She's
a lot older than 50.
She is a lot older than 50, and she 80 at the time she embarks on this journey, right? So she's about 80 years old. She will die. She will pass away at the age of 90, and she was the longest person to live in the mansion, the longest tenant. But some liberties are taken in terms of her likeness and representation, right?
I want to look that good when I'm in my 80s. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, Angela.
No. But she took good care of herself and lived a very comfortable life, we have to remember, right?
Where did her family make all the money?
That could lead us into, if you
A completely different conversation.
3 hours.
The short answer, unless you want to take this, Angela.
Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
The short answer to that is Eliza was born in poverty, married her first husband, Stephen, who was a French wine merchant. And then she actually was very business savvy and got more money for both of them through real estate.
Correct.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I have to say, I was very conscious of leaving certain details out, because when you really delve into the research and the story of Eliza Jumel, especially we have a lot of Eliza Jumel fans on this talk right now, that you will know that there's a lot of legend and myth and things that have grown. And I didn't want to lead with that story of how she became a wealthy woman, because I think you start off with judgment. So I wanted Eliza to speak for herself today, and that maybe on another talk we'll come back. And that reminds me that there will be a talk following my lecture today, and I want to make sure I make room for that. But I invite you to today, over the weekend, to think about how would you want to be represented. You know, we saw how Burr really kind of manipulated his image, how Eliza commissioned her portraits. How would you want to be captured? And if you feel creatively inspired, sketch it or photograph yourself, take a selfie, and tag us and share it with us at the mansion. You can find out more information at the Morris-Jumel Mansion Museum, which was established as a museum in 1904, and its collections at morrisjumel.org. You can follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, with the hashtag Morris-Jumel, but also tag us and we can keep the conversation going. I could chat back and answer all these questions I wasn't able to answer for you. And
as Meg reminds us, if you do share any portraits on any of our social media channels, we will repost.
Thank you. And lastly, we all invite you to keep diving into the history and the story. And Professor Catherine Manthorn will be presenting and leading a virtual parlor chat July 15th at 7 p.m. So bring your cocktails and join us, and we'll get into another discussion there. I think a promising lecture by Professor Manthorn. And lastly, just thank you for joining us. I want to thank you. I know these are crazy times, but the fact that you would have tuned in your lunch hour on a Monday, no less, I appreciate. And from every city home you're in, inviting me here. And we're still working, we're still doing research, and we're planning great things virtual, and when we are able to greet you back in person. So stay in touch with us, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, girls.
Garcia.
Thank you. Bravo.
Thank you.
Angela, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.
And thank you to colleagues at other museums that I'm seeing on this call as they're leaving, friends of the mansion, staff that joined us. It's nice to feel connected through Portraiture and through the mansion.